The lawyer's voice carried across the mahogany table with the practiced detachment of someone who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer registered as tragedy. Elena Vasquez sat very still in the leather chair that seemed designed to swallow her whole, her hands folded in her lap where no one could see them trembling. The conference room smelled of furniture polish and old money, scents that had never belonged to her world and never would. Through the tall windows behind the lawyer's head, the city stretched out in glass and steel, indifferent to the unraveling of one woman's life. She had known this meeting would be difficult. What she had not anticipated was the surgical precision with which her ex-husband's family would dismantle everything she had believed about her place in their world. The divorce papers had been finalized 3 months earlier, but this gathering was not about closure. It was about erasure. The lawyer's words blurred together into a language that felt deliberately constructed to confuse. Asset distribution, irrevocable trust provisions, contested claims. Elena understood enough to know that every sentence was another door closing, another avenue of appeal exhausted. The house where she had raised her daughter for 7 years would be sold. The college fund she had believed was protected had been redirected through mechanisms she could not follow. Even the car she drove, registered in a name that had once been hers through marriage, would be repossessed within the week. Across the table, her former sister-in-law examined her fingernails with the expression of someone waiting for an inconvenience to resolve itself. Beside her, Elena's ex-mother-in-law maintained a posture of glacial dignity, as though the meeting were a minor administrative task rather than the dismantling of a family. Neither woman had spoken to Elena directly since the divorce became public. They communicated through lawyers, through intermediaries, through silence that carried more contempt than any words could have. Her ex-husband was not present. He had chosen to attend a business conference in Singapore rather than face the consequences of decisions made in his name. Elena had not been surprised. Cowardice dressed in expensive suits had been his defining characteristic long before she had been brave enough to name it. The settlement she was being offered was designed to look generous on paper, while ensuring she would never recover the stability she had once taken for granted. A modest lump sum, calculated precisely to be insufficient for a down payment in any neighborhood with decent schools. Temporary alimony, structured to expire exactly when her daughter would need it most. And a single piece of property, included in the distribution almost as an afterthought, so insignificant that the lawyer paused before mentioning it, as if embarrassed to waste breath on something so trivial. The T. Frost estate. The name meant nothing to Elena until the lawyer explained in a voice that barely concealed disdain. It was a tea plantation, or had been once, located in a remote mountain valley nearly 3 hours from the city. The property had been abandoned for decades, its structures collapsing under the weight of neglect, its fields reclaimed by wild growth. No one had visited the site in living memory. The family had attempted to sell it multiple times, but potential buyers walked away after seeing the condition of the land. Insurance companies refused to cover it. Local authorities had issued citations for safety violations that no one had bothered to address. The plantation's only value, the lawyer noted with a thin smile, was as a tax write-off. By transferring ownership to Elena, the family could claim the loss and distance themselves from any future liability. She was being offered the property for $1. A symbolic transaction that would allow them to erase it from their holdings while ensuring she bore responsibility for whatever problems it might generate. Her ex-mother-in-law spoke then, the first word she had directed at Elena in months. The woman's voice was soft, cultured, and carried the weight of a verdict that had been reached long before this meeting began. She said that the tea plantation was appropriate compensation for someone of Elena's background, that it reflected her inability to maintain the standards the family had tried to teach her, that perhaps working with dirt and decay would suit her better than the life she had failed to sustain through marriage. The words landed with the precision of surgical instruments, cutting not through flesh but through the thin membrane of composure Elena had been struggling to maintain. She felt her face flush, heat rising through her neck and into her cheeks, and hated herself for the visible reaction. Around the table, She saw the slight upward curve of her former sister-in-law's mouth, the satisfied glint in her ex-mother-in-law's eyes. They had been waiting for this moment, the confirmation that their assessment of her was correct, that beneath the veneer of education and effort, she was exactly what they had always believed her to be: disposable. The lawyer pushed a stack of documents across the polished surface, their pages marked with colored tabs indicating where Elena needed to sign. He explained that she could take time to review them, but his tone suggested such caution would be pointless. The terms would not change. The alternative was litigation that would consume whatever resources she had left, delaying the inevitable while enriching no one but the attorneys. Elena picked up the pen with hands that had steadied themselves through force of will. She read nothing. She could not afford to read, could not afford to let the words on those pages confirm what she already knew: that she had been defeated not by lack of effort, but by systems designed to ensure people like her never gained lasting footing. She signed where indicated, her signature smaller and more compressed with each document, as though she were trying to make herself disappear into the paper itself. When it was finished, the lawyer gathered the pages with practiced efficiency and stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Her ex-mother-in-law rose without looking at Elena, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her tailored dress. The former sister-in-law paused just long enough to offer a smile that held no warmth, only the satisfaction of watching someone fall from a height they should never have been allowed to reach. Elena remained seated until the room emptied, her body unwilling to move until the silence confirmed she was alone. The city beyond the windows continued its indifferent motion, and she understood with sudden clarity that no one out there knew or cared that a woman's life had just been reduced to a single worthless property and the echo of words designed to ensure she never forgot her place. She left the building through a side entrance, unable to face the marble lobby where she had once walked with her daughter's hand in hers, believing that belonging was something earned through love rather than blood. The afternoon air was cool and carried the exhaust of traffic and the distant smell of street vendor food. She walked without direction, letting her feet carry her through streets that had once felt familiar, but now seemed designed to reject her presence. Her phone buzzed with a message from her daughter's school. Olivia had been selected for an advanced placement program, but the tuition deposit was due within 2 weeks. The amount listed made Elena's chest tighten. It was exactly the kind of opportunity she had promised her daughter would always be available, the kind that should have been covered by the college fund that no longer existed. She stopped walking and leaned against the cool glass of a storefront, closing her eyes against the sting of tears that had been building since the lawyer's office. Around her, people flowed past without pause, their lives continuing uninterrupted by her crisis. She was invisible here, as she had always been invisible in rooms where decisions were made about her future without her input. That night, in the small apartment she had rented with the last of her savings, Elena spread the Plantation documents across the kitchen table. The overhead light buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across pages that described a property she had never seen and could not imagine wanting. Olivia was asleep in the only bedroom, her 12-year-old body curled beneath blankets Elena had brought from their old house before the locks were changed. The photographs attached to the property file were brutal in their honesty. They showed structures so deteriorated that walls had collapsed inward, roofs open to the sky. Fields that might once have been organized into neat rows of tea plants were now tangles of vegetation so dense that no clear lines remained. A stone building that appeared to have served as the main processing facility stood at an angle, its foundation compromised by decades of water damage and neglect. Rust-stained equipment lay scattered across what might have been a courtyard, unidentifiable metal shapes slowly being consumed by the earth. The property assessment was devastating. Contaminated soil from chemical runoff. Structural hazards requiring immediate attention. No access to utilities. No potable water source. Estimated cost of basic remediation exceeded any conceivable market value by a factor of 10. The final note, written in precise legal script, stated that the property was considered unsalvageable and should be surrendered to the county for demolition and land reclamation. Elena read every word 3 times, searching for something she knew was not there. Hope, possibility, a reason to believe that this was not the final humiliation it appeared to be. The property was worse than worthless. It was a liability, a burden that would generate costs she could not afford and problems she had no capacity to solve. Accepting it had been a mistake. Signing those documents had been the action of someone too exhausted to think clearly. She pulled up mapping software on her laptop, typing in the address listed on the deed. The satellite image that appeared showed a patch of dense forest interrupted by what might have been clearings, though the resolution was too low to distinguish detail. The plantation sat at the end of a road that seemed to terminate in nothing, surrounded by mountain terrain marked in shades of green that suggested elevation and isolation. The nearest town was 40 minutes away by car, assuming the roads were maintained, which the property report suggested they were not. The more she looked, the more impossible the situation became. She had no money to travel there, no means to assess the property properly, no knowledge of tea cultivation or agricultural reclamation. She was a medical billing specialist with a degree in communications, someone who had spent her adult life in offices and hospitals, not fields. The idea that she could transform this frozen, forgotten plantation into anything useful was absurd. And yet, as midnight passed and exhaustion began to blur her thoughts, a different kind of calculation began to form. The apartment lease would expire in 2 months. She could not afford to renew it, could not afford any rental in the city on the income from the part-time work she had cobbled together since the divorce. Homeless shelters had waiting lists. Friends who might have helped had gradually withdrawn, unwilling to entangle themselves in the drama of her separation from a family that still held power in their social circles. The tea plantation, worthless as it was, represented one thing the apartment did not. It was hers. No landlord could evict her from property she owned, however damaged. No one could take it away without legal proceedings that might buy her time to find another solution. And if the structures were truly as compromised as the photograph suggested, perhaps the county would be forced to intervene, providing relocation assistance or emergency housing that might open doors currently closed. It was not a plan. It was barely even a strategy. But it was the only option that did not require her to beg for mercy from people who had already demonstrated they possessed none. She closed the laptop and sat in the buzzing silence of the apartment, feeling something shift inside her. Not hope, which felt too large and too fragile to trust, but determination, narrow and cold, the kind that came from having nowhere left to fall. 3 days later, Elena loaded everything she owned in her car. The vehicle was technically still hers for another week before the repossession order took effect, and she intended to use every hour of that grace period. Olivia sat in the passenger seat, watching the city recede through the window with the quiet resignation of a child who had learned not to ask questions when adults made decisions that shattered the world. Elena had told her daughter the truth, though she had softened it in the way all parents do when protecting children from realities that should not be their burden. They were moving to the mountains, to a property that had belonged to her father's family, but was now theirs. It needed work, maybe a lot of work, but it would be an adventure. A fresh start away from schools where everyone knew the story of the divorce, away from neighborhoods where their old friends no longer made eye contact in grocery stores. Olivia had not protested. She had simply packed her books and clothes with the mechanical efficiency of someone far older than 12, and Elena had felt her heart crack a little wider. This was not the childhood she had promised. This was not the stability she had worked so desperately to provide. The drive took longer than expected. The highway gave way to smaller roads that curved through forested hills, each turn taking them farther from the infrastructure and services Elena had relied on her entire life. Gas stations became scarce, then absent. Towns shrank to clusters of buildings that looked more historical than functional. Her phone's signal weakened, then vanished entirely, leaving them navigating by paper maps and road signs that had weathered into illegibility. When they finally turned onto the access road leading to T. Frost Estate, the pavement ended. The path ahead was gravel, rutted and overgrown with vegetation that scraped against the car's undercarriage with sounds that made Elena wince. She drove slowly, conscious that a breakdown here would be catastrophic. There was no cell service to call for help, no visible houses where she might ask for assistance. They were alone in a way she had never experienced, the forest pressing in on both sides with an indifference that felt almost hostile. The road climbed steadily, winding through terrain that grew steeper and more remote. Sunlight filtered through dense canopy in scattered patches, creating shadows that shifted and danced across the windshield. Olivia had stopped watching out the window and now stared straight ahead, her hands gripping the edge of her seat with unconscious tension. When they finally emerged into a clearing, Elena's first reaction was not relief but despair. The photographs had not lied. If anything, they had been generous. The structures before them were ruins, shells of buildings that looked as though they had been abandoned mid-collapse and left to complete their disintegration without interference. The main house, or what remained of it, leaned precariously to one side, its windows empty of glass, its front porch sagging under the weight of a roof that appeared held together more by habit than structural integrity. She turned off the engine and they sat in silence, absorbing the reality of what they had driven 3 hours to claim. This was not a property. It was a graveyard of agricultural ambition, a monument to failure so complete that even the forest seemed reluctant to fully reclaim it. Olivia spoke first, her voice small but steady. She asked if this was really their new home, and Elena heard the careful neutrality in the question, the effort not to let disappointment show. She wanted to lie, to offer reassurance that everything would be fine. Instead, she reached over and took her daughter's hand, squeezing it once before opening the car door and stepping out into the cold mountain air. The plantation stretched out before them, field after field of tangled vegetation, hiding whatever structure had once existed beneath. In the distance, she could see the stone processing building from the photographs, its walls dark with moisture and age. Closer, a series of smaller structures formed a rough perimeter around what might have been a central courtyard. Most were beyond salvage, their roofs gone, their walls buckling. But as Elena walked slowly across the uneven ground, her boots crunching on gravel and frozen earth, she noticed something the photographs had not captured: the scale. The plantation was enormous, far larger than she had imagined from the satellite images. Acres and acres of land rolled away from the clearing, following the mountain's contours and terraced levels that spoke of careful planning from a time when this place had been alive with purpose. She moved toward the main house, testing each step on the porch before committing her weight. It had grown beneath her, but held. The front door hung at an angle, its hinges corroded, but it swung open when she pushed gently. Inside, the smell hit her immediately. Mildew, rot, and something else underneath. Something older and more complex, like dried herbs and earth. The interior was a chaos of collapsed ceilings and water-damaged walls. Furniture lay scattered and broken, its shapes barely recognizable. In what had been the kitchen, a cast-iron stove sat like a monument to a different era, its surface rusted but somehow still solid. Sunlight poured through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air. Elena stood in the center of what had been the living room and tried to imagine making this place habitable. The task felt impossible. She had no money for repairs, no skills for construction, no idea where to begin. The cold that seeped through the broken walls reminded her that winter was coming, that shelter would not be optional. She returned to the car where Olivia waited, her daughter's expression carefully neutral. Together they unloaded what they could carry, bringing sleeping bags, clothes, and the portable camp stove Elena had purchased with the last of her credit. They would sleep in the car tonight, in the only room they could be certain would not collapse around them. As dusk settled over the plantation, Elena built a small fire in a ring of stones near the car. The flames pushed back the darkness just enough to create an illusion of safety. Olivia sat close to her mother, wrapped in blankets, eating canned soup heated over the camp stove. Neither spoke about the ruins surrounding them or about the life they had left behind. There was nothing to say that would not make the reality harder to bear. That night, as Olivia slept in the back seat and Elena sat in the driver's seat watching shadows move across the broken buildings, she allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, not with the release that might have brought relief, just quiet tears that ran down her face and dripped onto her jacket, marking the moment when pride finally gave way to the truth she could no longer deny. She had failed. Her marriage had failed. Her finances had failed. And now she sat in a car in the middle of nowhere with a child depending on her and absolutely no idea how to move forward. The next morning arrived with a frost so thick it looked like snow. Elena woke to find her breath misting in the cold air, the car windows opaque with ice. Her body ached from sleeping upright, her neck stiff and her back protesting every movement. Beside her, Olivia stirred, pulling blankets tighter against the cold without fully waking. Elena climbed out of the car, carefully, wincing as the frozen air bit at her exposed skin. The plantation looked even more desolate in the pale morning light, the shadows less forgiving, the damage more apparent. She walked to where they had built the fire the night before and found only cold ash, the stones still arranged in their careful circle. Everything she touched felt brittle, as though the cold had reached into the molecular structure of the world and made it harder, less forgiving. She needed water. The bottles she had brought from the city were nearly empty, and they could not survive here without a reliable source. The property report had mentioned a well, though it had been marked as potentially contaminated. She walked the perimeter of the clearing, searching for any structure that might house a water source. Near the edge of the forest, partially hidden by overgrown brush, she found a stone enclosure. The wooden cover that had once protected it had rotted away, leaving the opening exposed. She approached carefully, peering into the dark shaft. She could see water far below, reflecting the morning light in a circle of silver. She had no way to test its safety, no equipment to draw it up, even if she were willing to risk using it. The realization settled over her with exhausting finality. Every basic necessity that she had taken for granted her entire life was now a problem to be solved without resources or knowledge. A sound made her turn. Olivia had emerged from the car, wrapped in a blanket, her hair tangled and her face pale with cold. She walked to where Elena stood and looked down into the well with an expression that reminded Elena painfully of her daughter's father. That same analytical gaze, measuring problems against solutions, calculating odds before committing. Olivia asked if the water was safe, and Elena had to admit she did not know. Her daughter nodded, as though this were an acceptable answer, then suggested they explore the property more thoroughly before deciding what to do next. The practicality of it, the absence of panic or complaint, made Elena want to pull her daughter close and apologize for everything that had brought them to this moment. Instead, she agreed, and together they walked away from the car toward the stone processing building she had seen from a distance. The structure was larger than it had appeared in the photographs. Its walls built from mountain stone fitted together with a precision that spoke of skilled craftsmanship. The roof had partially collapsed, but sections remained intact, offering shelter from the elements. The main entrance gaped open, its heavy wooden doors long since torn away by weather or vandals. Inside, the building was divided into sections separated by half-walls and timber beams that still bore their original markings. Chinese characters had been carved into several beams, their meaning lost to Elena, but their presence a reminder that this place had been built by people with knowledge and purpose. The floor was littered with debris, broken equipment, and what appeared to be the remains of wooden crates that had disintegrated into scattered boards. They moved through the space slowly, Olivia trailing her hand along the stone walls, Elena testing the stability of the floor with each step. Halfway through the building, they found something unexpected, a section of floor that appeared more solid than the rest, its surface smoother, darker. Elena knelt and brushed away dust and debris, revealing stone that had been cut and fitted with the same care as the walls. It was a trapdoor, or the outline of one, rectangular and large enough to accommodate a person. The edges were almost invisible, the seam so precise that only the slight difference in stone color gave away its presence. Elena ran her fingers along one edge, searching for a mechanism or handle. She found neither, only smooth stone that offered no obvious way to open it. She sat back on her heels, staring at the hidden door with a mixture of curiosity and frustration. This plantation kept revealing layers she had not anticipated. First, the scale of the property. Now this suggestion of spaces beneath spaces, secrets buried under decades of neglect. Part of her wanted to walk away, to accept that some mysteries were not worth solving, especially when every hour demanded attention to more immediate survival needs. But another part, smaller and more stubborn, wondered what had been important enough to hide beneath a stone floor in a building designed to process tea. She thought of the lawyer's dismissive tone when describing the property, of her ex-mother-in-law's calculated cruelty in choosing this particular humiliation. They had expected her to surrender immediately, to sign the deed back over to the county and walk away with nothing. That expectation made her want to prove them wrong, even if the only person who would ever know was herself. She stood and looked at Olivia, who was examining the carved characters on a nearby beam with the focused attention of a child trying to find order in chaos. Elena made a decision then, one that felt reckless and necessary in equal measure. They would stay. They would make this work, however impossible it appeared. Not because she had a plan, but because surrendering now would mean accepting every judgment that had been made about her worth. The morning stretched into afternoon as they continued exploring. They found more evidence of the plantation's former life. Rusted machinery that might have been used for processing leaves, storage sheds filled with rotted sacks that had once held tea, pipes and channels that suggested an elaborate water management system. Everything was damaged. Everything required work that seemed beyond their capacity. But the more Elena saw, the more she understood that this place had been built to last, designed by people who believed in its future. That belief, however misplaced it had proven, felt like something she could build on. As the sun began to lower toward the mountain ridges, they returned to the car. Elena started the engine and let it run, using the heater to warm the interior while they ate dinner from cans heated on the camp stove. The fuel gauge was dropping, and she knew they could not keep using the car's engine for warmth much longer. Tomorrow she would need to make decisions about the house, about whether any part of it could be made weatherproof enough to shelter them through the coming winter. That night, as they prepared to sleep again in the cramped back seat, Olivia asked a question that Elena had been dreading. She asked if they were poor now, if they would always have to live like this. Elena searched for words that would be honest without being cruel, that would acknowledge their reality without stealing hope. She told her daughter that they had less than they used to, but more than many people. That they owned land, which was something valuable even when the structures on it were not. That they were together, which was what mattered most. She did not mention the bills accumulating in her email, the calls from creditors she could no longer answer, the knowledge that they were living on borrowed time measured in days rather than months. Olivia accepted this with a quiet nod, then turned toward the window where frost was already beginning to form. After a long silence, she spoke again, her voice drowsy with approaching sleep. She said the stone building had felt peaceful, despite being broken. That sometimes broken things were easier to fix than people expected, because no one was watching to see if you did it right. Elena lay awake long after her daughter's breathing settled into the rhythm of sleep, turning those words over in her mind. No one was watching. It was true. They were alone here in a way that felt both terrifying and liberating. There were no neighbors to judge their progress, no family members to document their failures. The plantation's isolation, which had seemed like a curse, might also be a gift. A chance to rebuild without an audience, to make mistakes without witnesses. As exhaustion finally pulled her toward unconsciousness, Elena's last thoughts turned to the hidden stone door they had found beneath the processing building. In the morning, she decided she would find a way to open it. Not because she believed it held anything valuable, but because understanding all of what they had inherited felt like a necessary first step toward making any of it their own. The mountain air was silent and cold, and the ruins around them held their secrets with the patience of things that had outlasted everything that had tried to claim them. Morning came with unexpected clarity. The sky was cloudless, the frost glittering across every surface like scattered diamonds. Elena woke before Olivia, her body protesting another night in the car, but her mind already moving through the tasks ahead. They needed water, they needed heat, and they needed to determine if any structure on this property could serve as actual shelter before nightfall. She left Olivia sleeping and walked back to the stone processing building. In daylight, without the pressure of yesterday's exhaustion, she could see detail she had missed before. The walls showed evidence of careful maintenance at some point in the past. Sections had been repointed, stones replaced where weather had damaged them. Someone had cared for this place, had invested effort in its preservation even as other structures fell into ruin. The hidden door in the floor pulled at her attention. She knelt beside it again, running her hands along the edges with more patience this time. The stone was cold enough to numb her fingers, but she persisted, searching for any irregularity that might indicate a mechanism. Near one corner, she felt it. A slight depression, no larger than her thumb, positioned where it would be invisible unless you were looking for it specifically. She pressed down, felt resistance, then the faint grinding of stone against stone. The sound was so subtle she might have imagined it, but the trapdoor shifted almost imperceptibly. She applied more pressure, and the section of floor sank an inch, then slid to the side with a whisper of movement that spoke of counterweights and engineering far more sophisticated than she had expected. Cold air rushed up from the opening, carrying with it a scent that stopped her breath. Not mildew or rot, but something clean and complex. Dried herbs, earth, and underneath it all, a sweet fragrance that reminded her of honey and wood smoke. She sat back on her heels, staring into the darkness below. A ladder was built into the wall of the shaft, its rungs carved from the same stone as everything else. They descended into shadow that her eyes could not penetrate from above. Elena retrieved her phone from her pocket, grateful that at least the flashlight function worked even without signal. She turned it on and aimed the beam downward. The light revealed a chamber far larger than the trapdoor suggested. Stone walls extended in several directions, and she could see the edges of what appeared to be shelving or terrace platforms carved directly from the rock. The air coming up was cold, but not damp. Somewhere below, this space had been designed to maintain consistent temperature and humidity. She should wait. She should bring Olivia, or better yet, find someone with knowledge of old buildings who could assess the safety of descending into an unknown space. But the isolation of the plantation meant there was no one to ask, no expertise to consult, and the scent rising from below suggested something more than an empty cellar. Elena began to climb down. Each rung was wide and secure, the stone cool under her hands. She counted 15 steps before her feet met level ground. The flashlight beam swept across the chamber, and what it revealed made her forget to breathe. The space was enormous, extending far beyond the footprint of the building above. Stone walls curved away in both directions, terraced with wide shelves that held stacks of wooden boxes. The boxes were uniform in size, their construction precise, their surfaces marked with Chinese characters identical to those she had seen on the building's beams. There were hundreds of them, arranged in neat rows that spoke of organization and care. She approached the nearest shelf and examined one of the boxes. The wood was dark with age but solid, its joints tight and undamaged by moisture. She lifted it carefully and was surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside was dense and substantial. The lid was secured with a simple wooden peg that slid free easily. She set the box down and opened it. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be paper made from plant fibers, were dark compressed cakes of tea leaves. The wrapping crinkled softly as she pulled back layers, revealing the tea itself. The leaves were so dark they appeared black, their surfaces slightly oily, their scent intensifying as air reached them. She had seen tea like this once, years ago, in a specialty shop where her ex-husband had bought gifts for business associates. Aged tea, the kind that appreciated in value as it matured under controlled conditions. She opened another box, then another. Each held the same compressed cakes, though the sizes and shapes varied slightly. Some were round and flat, others square and thick. All bore stamps pressed into their surfaces, characters and designs that might have indicated origin, age, or quality. She had no way to read them, no knowledge to assess what she was looking at. But the care with which everything had been stored, the engineering of this chamber to maintain stable conditions, suggested value beyond anything she had anticipated. Elena's hands began to shake as the implications settled over her. This was not a forgotten stockpile or abandoned inventory. This was a collection that someone had believed worth protecting, worth preserving in a chamber designed to last centuries. The boxes extended into darkness beyond her flashlight beam, row after row of them, and she had only examined 3. She climbed back up the ladder with a sense of urgency that bordered on panic. The morning sun felt too bright after the darkness below, and she blinked against the glare as she emerged into the processing building. Olivia was walking toward her from the direction of the car, wrapped in blankets, her expression shifting from drowsiness to alert concern when she saw her mother's face. Elena told her to get back in the car, to warm up while she checked something. Her daughter opened her mouth to ask questions, then seemed to recognize something in Elena's voice that made questions irrelevant. She turned and walked back to the vehicle without protest. Alone again, Elena returned to the edge of the trapdoor and stared down into darkness. She had spent years in medical billing, reviewing insurance claims and treatment codes. She understood the principle of value assessment, of determining what something was worth based on documentation and market comparison. But this was beyond her expertise in ways that felt overwhelming. She needed information. The plantation had no internet, no cell service, no way to research what she had found. The nearest town was 40 minutes away, and even there, she doubted anyone would have knowledge of aged Chinese tea. But the town would have a library, or at least someone with internet access who could help her understand what she was looking at. The drive back down a mountain road felt different this time. Elena's hands gripped the steering wheel with renewed purpose, her mind racing through possibilities and problems in equal measure. Beside her, Olivia sat quietly, sensing that something had changed, but patient enough not to push for immediate explanations. The town, when they reached it, looked like something preserved from another era. A single main street lined with buildings that had weathered decades without significant change. A general store, a post office, a diner with faded painted windows. At the far end of the street, a small library occupied what had once been a church, its steeple still intact, but its interior converted to shelves and reading tables. Elena parked in front of the library and left Olivia in the car with instructions to honk the horn if anything felt wrong. Inside, the building smelled of old books and floor wax. A woman in her 60s looked up from the circulation desk with the mild surprise of someone amused to visitors. Elena asked if they had internet access, and a librarian directed her to a computer station near the back. The machine was old, its connection slow, but it worked. Elena pulled up search engines and began typing. Aged tea, Chinese compressed tea, tea storage chambers. The results overwhelmed her with their volume and complexity. She refined her searches, adding terms like value and rare and investment. What she found made her pulse quicken. Aged tea, particularly from certain regions of China, had become a collector's market in recent decades. Premium aged pure tea could sell for thousands of dollars per kilogram. Rare vintages, properly stored, had sold at auction for prices that made her question whether the information could be accurate. One article described a single compressed cake of aged tea selling for over $20,000 because of its provenance and condition. She searched for images, comparing them to her memory of what she had seen in the chamber. The shapes matched. The packaging was similar. The stamps pressed into the tea surfaces appeared consistent with what the articles described as authentication marks from legitimate producers. She had no way to verify age or quality without expert assessment, but the possibility that she had found something valuable was becoming harder to dismiss. Elena spent 2 hours in the library, filling a notebook with information, printing pages when the antiquated printer allowed. She learned about storage requirements for aged tea, about the importance of consistent temperature and humidity, about how improper conditions could ruin value. The stone chamber beneath the processing building, with its stable, cool air and careful construction, seemed designed precisely for this purpose. She learned about markets, about collectors in China and Taiwan who paid premium prices for authentic aged tea. She found contact information for auction houses that specialized in rare tea, for consultants who offered authentication services. The more she read, the more she understood that what she had stumbled upon might be worth not thousands, but millions, if the collection was authentic and properly preserved. When she finally returned to the car, Olivia looked up from the book she had been reading with patient curiosity. Elena's mind was still processing information, building calculations, trying to determine next steps. She started the engine and pulled back onto the main road, heading toward the mountain with thoughts that felt too fragile to speak aloud. Back at the plantation, Elena descended into the chamber again, this time with Olivia beside her. Her daughter's eyes widened as the flashlight revealed the extent of the collection, row upon row of boxes extending into shadows. They walked among the shelves together, Elena explaining what she had learned, what the tea might be worth, what it could mean for their future if any of it proved authentic. Olivia listened with the seriousness of someone being trusted with important information. She asked practical questions. How would they prove it was real? How would they sell it? How would they protect it until they knew what they had? Elena had answers to none of these questions, but the asking of them felt like the beginning of something she had lost months ago. Partnership, planning, the belief that the future was something to be built rather than endured. They spent the rest of the day documenting what they found. Elena used her phone camera to photograph boxes, to capture the characters stamped on the tea, to record the layout of the chamber. She counted rows and calculated approximate volumes, arriving at numbers that seemed impossible. If even a fraction of this collection was authentic, if even the lower estimates she had found were accurate, they were standing in the middle of wealth that would dwarf anything her ex-husband's family had ever controlled. As afternoon faded toward evening, they climbed out of the chamber and sealed the trapdoor carefully. Elena's body was exhausted, but her mind felt clear for the first time since the divorce papers had been served. They had shelter, however damaged. They had a discovery that demanded careful attention and expert evaluation. And they had time, at least for now, to figure out how to transform this frozen, forgotten plantation into something that might save them. That night, sitting by another small fire near the car, Elena allowed herself to imagine possibilities she had been too afraid to consider. Olivia warm in a real house with solid walls and working heat. Debt paid off not gradually, but completely. Her daughter's future secured not through sacrifice and struggle, but through inheritance of a different kind. Resources that could be directed toward dreams rather than survival. She did not let herself believe it fully. The gap between discovery and validation was enormous, filled with obstacles she could only begin to anticipate. But for the first time since signing those divorce papers, she felt something other than despair. She felt the dangerous, fragile stirring of hope. The first expert Elena contacted refused to visit the property. His email response was brief and dismissive, explaining that remote mountain plantations abandoned for decades rarely yielded anything of value, and that his consultation fee of $5,000 would be wasted on what was almost certainly a collection of degraded, worthless tea. He suggested she photograph a representative sample and send it to him for preliminary assessment, but even that service required advance payment she could not afford. The second expert never responded at all. Elena's email sat unanswered in an inbox that likely received dozens of similar inquiries every week from people convinced they had discovered hidden treasure in their attics or inherited estates. She was learning quickly that the gap between finding something potentially valuable and having anyone take that finding seriously was vast and expensive to cross. The third expert, a consultant based in San Francisco who specialized in Asian antiquities, responded with cautious interest. Dr. James Chen's email was professional but skeptical. He explained that authentication of aged tea required physical examination, laboratory analysis, and documentation that most claimants could not provide. However, he said if Elena could send high-resolution photographs of the tea cakes, their packaging, and any identifying marks, he would review them at no charge and provide a preliminary opinion. Elena spent an entire day in the chamber, photographing boxes from every angle. She documented the characters stamped into the tea, the wrapping materials, the construction of the boxes themselves. She captured the layout of the storage space, the stone walls, the consistent cool temperature that her phone's thermometer showed remained between 55 and 60 degrees regardless of the weather above ground. When she finally had over 200 images, she drove back to the town library and spent hours uploading them to a file-sharing service, the ancient computer protesting the size of the transfer. Dr. Chin's response came 3 days later, and the tone had shifted dramatically. He asked if the photographs were authentic, if the collection was really as extensive as it appeared, if Elena had any documentation regarding the plantation's history or the tea's provenance. His questions came rapid-fire, each one revealing more interest than the last. He said he needed to see the collection in person, that he could travel to the property within a week if Elena could provide directions and assurance of access. The relief Elena felt was tempered immediately by practical reality. She had no money to compensate an expert for his time and travel. The plantation had no amenities to offer a visitor accustomed to urban comfort. She and Olivia were still sleeping in the car, still heating canned food over a camp stove, still using the questionable well water for washing because bottled water was too expensive to waste. Inviting someone to witness their circumstances felt like opening herself to judgment she could not defend against. But the alternative was worse. Without expert authentication, the tea remained only a possibility. Without validation, she had no way to move forward, no means to transform discovery into security. She responded to Dr. Chun with careful honesty, explaining their situation, offering no apologies, but making clear what he would find if he chose to come. She expected him to withdraw his interest. Instead, he responded within hours that he would arrive in 5 days, that he would bring his own supplies and required nothing beyond access to the collection. Those 5 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt simultaneously urgent and futile. Elena could not make the plantation presentable, could not transform ruins into hospitality, but she could organize what mattered. She spent hours in the chamber, creating a detailed inventory system. She assigned each box a number, photographed its contents, recorded its position on the shelves. The work was meticulous and exhausting. It gave her something to do besides worry about whether an expert's arrival would confirm her hope or destroy it. Olivia helped with quiet efficiency, learning to handle the tea cakes with the reverence Elena had discovered they required. Her daughter had stopped asking when they would have a real house, had stopped mentioning friend from her old school. Instead, she focused on immediate tasks, making herself useful in ways that broke Elena's heart, even as she felt grateful for the help. On the morning Dr. Chun was scheduled to arrive, Elena woke before dawn and did what she could to make the plantation look less like a disaster. She swept the processing building's floor, cleared debris from the entrance, arranged the few pieces of intact furniture into something that might pass for a workspace. It was inadequate, she knew, but it was all she had to offer. Dr. Chun arrived precisely when he said he would, his rental car navigating the rutted access road with visible difficulty. He emerged from the vehicle looking nothing like Elena had imagined. She had pictured someone older, formal, judgmental. The man who approached was perhaps 45, dressed in practical outdoor clothing, carrying a backpack and equipment cases with the ease of someone accustomed to field work. His expression was neutral but not cold, assessing but not dismissive. He introduced himself with a handshake that was brief and professional, then asked to see the collection immediately. Elena led him to the processing building, explaining as they walked the layout of the property, the condition she had found it in, the accident of discovering the hidden chamber. He listened without comment, his attention focused not on her words, but on the stone structure they were approaching. Inside, Elena opened the trapdoor with movements that had become practiced. Dr. Chun knelt beside the opening, examining the mechanism with interest that seemed to sharpen as he noted the precision of the engineering. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and aimed it downward, studying the chamber below for a long moment before speaking. When he finally did, his voice carried a tension that had not been there before. He asked how many boxes there were, and Elena told him she had counted 374 so far, but the shelves extended beyond where her flashlight reached, and she had not yet cataloged the entire space. Dr. Chun climbed down the ladder without hesitation. Elena followed, watching as he approached the nearest shelf and examined the boxes with the intensity that made her breath catch. He put on white cotton gloves before touching anything, a gesture that seemed to confirm the seriousness of what he was evaluating. He selected a box, opened it with careful movements, and unwrapped the tea cake inside. His breathing changed, became shallower, more controlled. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket and studied the surface of the tea in minute detail. Minutes passed in silence. Elena stood apart, afraid that speaking would break whatever concentration he had entered. Finally, Dr. Chin set down the loupe and turned to look at her directly. His expression was difficult to read, caught between professional composure and something that looked almost like disbelief. He said that he needed to examine multiple boxes, that preliminary assessment was not enough to make definitive statements. But he said in a way that made Elena's pulse accelerate, as though the words he was not saying were more important than the ones he was. They spent the next 4 hours in the chamber. Dr. Chen selected boxes from different sections of the shelves, examining their contents with meticulous attention. He took measurements, made notes, photographed details with a camera far more sophisticated than Elena's phone. Occasionally, he would make soft sounds of recognition or surprise, though he offered no explanation for either. Elena watched and waited, her body tense with anticipation she was afraid to acknowledge. When they finally climbed back up to ground level, the afternoon sun was angling toward evening. Dr. Chin walked outside without speaking, moving to his car where he retrieved a laptop and a satellite internet device. He set up his equipment on the hood of the vehicle and began typing with urgent focus, occasionally pausing to scroll through images or consult notes. Elena stood at a distance, afraid to interrupt, afraid to ask the questions that were threatening to overwhelm her ability to remain patient. Finally, Dr. Chin looked up and asked her to join him. His screen showed an auction site she did not recognize, text in both English and Chinese, images of tea similar to what they had found in the chamber. He scrolled through listings, pointing out prices that made Elena's vision narrow. $15,000, $30,000, $55,000. These were individual cakes, he explained, not collections. Single pieces of authenticated aged tea sold at premium prices to collectors who understood their value. He told her what he had found in the chamber. The tea was legitimate, from what he could assess without laboratory confirmation. Multiple varieties, some extremely rare, all stored under conditions that had preserved them far better than he would have expected after decades of neglect. The packaging was consistent with production from a specific region of Yunnan province, known for premium tea cultivation in the mid-20th century. The stamps pressed into the tea surfaces were authentication marks used by factories that no longer existed, making provenance trackable but also limiting the number of comparable sales for valuation purposes. He estimated, and he emphasized this was only an estimate pending full analysis, that the collection contained between 2,000 and 3,000 individual tea cakes. If even half were authentic and well-preserved, they were looking at a collection worth tens of millions of dollars. If the preservation was as good throughout as what he had examined so far, the number could climb significantly higher. Elena heard the words, but could not fully process them. Tens of millions. The phrase felt unreal, too large to attach meaning to. Dr. Chun continued talking, explaining the process for formal authentication, for reaching collectors, for managing a discovery of this magnitude. His words became background noise to the roaring in Elena's ears, the physical sensation of her entire understanding of reality shifting beneath her. She interrupted him, her voice sharper than she intended, and asked if he was certain. If this was actually real, or if he was mistaken, or if there was some other explanation that would make more sense than the possibility that she had inherited a fortune hidden beneath a property everyone had dismissed as worthless. Dr. Chun met her gaze steadily and said that uncertainty was why formal authentication existed, but that in 30 years of evaluating aged tea, he had never seen a collection of this quality and scale outside of government warehouses in China. The implications crashed over her in waves. Security for Olivia. Debt eliminated not gradually, but instantly. The ability to make choices based on what she wanted rather than what she could afford. The chance to prove wrong every person who had dismissed her as someone who had married above her station and deserved to fall when that marriage collapsed. The vindication felt almost as overwhelming as the financial transformation. But Dr. Chen's next words brought her back to immediate reality with force. He explained that a collection this valuable would attract attention they needed to manage carefully. Authentication would require multiple experts, documentation, secure storage during the evaluation process. The current condition of the plantation, with no security and easy access, was unacceptable. Word of the discovery would spread quickly in collector communities, and they needed to establish protection before that happened. He said he could help, that his firm could coordinate the authentication process, but that Elena needed to make decisions about how to proceed. The chamber had kept the tea safe for decades, but now that its existence was known, however limited that knowledge currently was, the risk of theft or damage increased exponentially with every person who learned about it. They needed security, they needed insurance, they needed legal structures to protect both the collection and Elena's claim to it. Elena felt the crushing weight of problems she had no idea how to solve. Security required money she did not have. Insurance for a collection worth tens of millions was not something she could arrange with a phone call and a credit card. Legal structures required attorneys she could not afford to consult. Every solution Dr. Chun described required resources that remained just as out of reach as they had been before the discovery. She explained this with blunt honesty, too exhausted to maintain pride. She told him about the divorce, about the deliberate humiliation of being given this property as a joke, about the last month sleeping in a car with her daughter while trying to figure out how to survive. She said she understood the collection was valuable, but that understanding did nothing to solve the immediate problem of not having money to protect it, to authenticate it, to do anything beyond sit on the discovery and hope no one found out about it before she could figure out next steps. Dr. Chun listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, then asked if she would be willing to enter into a formal arrangement with his firm. They would advance the costs of authentication, security, and legal protection in exchange for a percentage of the eventual sale proceeds. The percentage would be negotiable, but substantial, reflecting the risk they would be taking and the resources they would be providing. It was not charity, he emphasized. It was business, structured to protect both parties. Elena asked how much his firm would take, and Dr. Chun said it would depend on the final valuation, but likely between 15 and 20%. The number made her chest tighten. 15% of tens of millions was still millions. But 85% of tens of millions was more than she could have imagined acquiring in 10 lifetimes. And more importantly, without his firm's involvement, she had no path forward at all. The tea could be worth $1 billion, but if she could not authenticate it, protect it, or access the markets where it would sell, its value was theoretical at best. She told him she needed to think about it, and he nodded as though he had expected nothing else. He said he would send her a formal proposal within 24 hours, outlining exactly what his firm would provide and what they would require in return. He suggested she consult an attorney before signing anything, though he acknowledged with surprising candor that finding an attorney who specialized in this particular type of situation would be challenging on short notice. As he packed his equipment and prepared to leave, Dr. Chen paused and said something that stayed with Elena long after his rental car disappeared down the access road. He said that most people who discovered something valuable squandered it through impatience or poor advice. That the difference between a life-changing discovery and a cautionary tale was often just the discipline to move carefully and the wisdom to accept help from people who understood what you did not. He was not sure which path Elena would take, but he hoped she would choose carefully. That night, after Olivia was asleep in the back seat, Elena sat by the fire and tried to process the day. Her phone had enough remaining battery to pull up the proposal Dr. Chun had sent, a detailed document outlining terms that felt simultaneously generous and extractive. His firm would advance up to $500,000 for authentication, security, and marketing. They would coordinate expert evaluations, arrange secure storage if necessary, manage outreach to collectors and auction houses. In exchange, they would receive 20% of gross sale proceeds, paid before any other distributions. Elena read the document 3 times, then pulled up the browser on her phone and began researching Dr. Chen's firm. The satellite internet device he had left for her use was slow but functional. She found their website professional and detailed, listing credentials and past sales that seemed legitimate. She found references to Dr. Chun in academic journals, authentication work he had done for museums and private collectors. Everything suggested he was exactly what he claimed to be, a consultant with expertise she needed and resources she lacked. But 20% felt enormous. 20% of $10 million was $2 million. 20% of $50 million was $10 million. Numbers that would make any other decision she had made in her life seem trivial by comparison. She wondered if there were other firms who would take less, other experts who would offer better terms. But she had already learned how difficult it was to get any expert to take her seriously. Dr. Chun had come, had evaluated the collection, had offered a path forward. Waiting for a better offer might mean losing the only offer she was likely to receive. The decision hung over her through another night of restless sleep. In the morning, she drove to the town library and used their computer to research similar agreements. She found forum discussions, blog posts, cautionary articles about collectors who had been exploited by consultants promising more than they delivered. But she also found stories of discoveries that had been lost entirely because owners had tried to manage authentication themselves without adequate expertise or resources. She called the number Dr. Chun had provided, expecting voicemail, but reaching him directly. She asked questions she had spent the night formulating. How would the authentication be conducted? Who would have physical access to the tea? What security measures would be implemented? What happened if the collection's value was less than estimated? What if it was more? Dr. Chun answered each question with patience, providing details that suggested he had anticipated her concerns. The conversation lasted over an hour. By the end, Elena felt no more certain than she had at the beginning, but she understood that certainty was not something the situation would offer. She was going to have to make a decision based on incomplete information and trust that had not yet been earned. It was the kind of leap she had spent her entire adult life avoiding, the kind of risk that had always seemed reckless rather than brave. But as she sat in the library parking lot after the call ended, she thought about the alternative, sitting on the collection while trying to find someone else to help, burning through days and weeks while the security risk grew and winter approached and their circumstances became more desperate. The tea had survived decades of neglect. It would not survive indefinitely if she failed to act. She sent the email before she could talk herself out of it. 3 sentences accepting Dr. Chen's proposal, requesting that final documents be sent for her signature, asking when his firm would begin implementation of the security measures he had described. The response came within minutes. Dr. Chun would return to the property in 3 days with a team to assess security needs and begin formal authentication. An advance of $50,000 would be deposited into an account he would help her establish, providing immediate resources for basic needs while longer-term plans were developed. $50,000. Elena stared at the number until it stopped looking like language and became just symbols on a screen. $50,000 would solve every immediate crisis. Rent, food, warmth, transportation, her daughter's school costs. Problems that had seemed insurmountable would become footnotes, irritations rather than emergencies. The money would not arrive instantly, she understood that. But knowing it was coming changed the texture of every worry that had been consuming her. She drove back to the plantation with thoughts that refused to organize themselves into coherent plans. Part of her wanted to celebrate, to tell Olivia that everything was going to be okay, that they had found a way forward. But another part remained cautious, scarred by too many promises that had dissolved under scrutiny. The tea was real. The value was likely real. But there were so many steps between discovery and security that celebration felt premature. Over the next 3 days, Elena continued working in the chamber. She photographed every box she had not yet documented, expanded her inventory system, tried to estimate the full extent of what they had inherited. The numbers kept growing. She had stopped at 374 boxes during her first count. But as she explored deeper into the chamber, she found additional shelving she had missed in the darkness. By the time she finished, her count had reached over 600 boxes, each containing between 4 and 12 tea cakes depending on size. If Dr. Chen's preliminary estimates were accurate, if the tea was as valuable as he suggested, they were looking at something that exceeded even his initial assessment. 600 boxes meant potentially 8,000 individual tea cakes. At conservative valuations, that was hundreds of millions of dollars. At premium valuations, the number climbed into territory Elena could not make herself believe. $1 billion worth of tea hidden beneath a plantation her ex-husband's family had given her as an insult. The irony was almost unbearable. They had meant to humiliate her, to assign her worth equivalent to the $1 they had charged for the property. They had never imagined the land contained anything valuable, had never bothered to research the plantation's history or investigate the structures that still stood. Their dismissiveness had been so complete that they had signed away a fortune without realizing it existed. Elena thought about her ex-mother-in-law's words in that conference room, how the tea plantation was appropriate for someone of her background, how working with dirt and decay would suit her better than the life she had failed to sustain. The memory made her smile now, a hard, cold smile that held no humor but considerable satisfaction. That woman had been so certain of Elena's irrelevance, so confident in her judgment, that she had never considered she might be wrong. When Dr. Chen returned with his team, they brought resources that transformed the plantation overnight. A security company installed cameras and motion sensors around the processing building and the chamber entrance. A law firm out of San Francisco had already prepared documents establishing a trust to hold the collection, protecting it from any claims Elena's ex-husband or his family might attempt once they learned what she had found. An accountant set up business structures that would minimize tax exposure when the tea was eventually sold. Everything happened with an efficiency that suggested careful planning and substantial resources. Dr. Chen brought 2 additional experts with him, specialists in aged tea from different regions of China who would provide independent authentication to supplement his own assessment. They descended into the chamber with the reverence of scholars entering an archive they had only read about, their voices soft with something close to awe as they examined the collection's scope. Elena watched them work and felt increasingly like a spectator at an event she no longer controlled. The authentication process was meticulous and slow. Each expert wanted to examine dozens of boxes, to sample tea from different sections of the storage space, to verify that the quality was consistent throughout rather than concentrated in the most visible areas. They took the samples with them when they left, promising laboratory analysis within 2 weeks that would confirm or refute the preliminary assessments. Dr. Chen estimated that full authentication would take 60 to 90 days, a timeline that felt both impossibly long and dangerously fast. During this time, the security team worked to secure not just the chamber but the entire plantation. They installed gates at the access road, reinforced the processing building's structure to prevent collapse, and brought in a temporary shelter that would provide Elena and Olivia with actual housing while longer-term solutions were developed. The shelter was industrial, designed for construction sites rather than families, but it had heat and solid walls and a real roof. Moving from the car into that simple structure felt like ascending into luxury. The $50,000 advance arrived in the account Dr. Chun had helped establish, and Elena spent it with a care that bordered on paranoia. She bought winter clothing for Olivia, proper shoes that fit, a laptop that would allow her daughter to continue schoolwork while they figured out logistics for enrolling her in a local school. She bought food that did not come from cans, a portable heater that would keep the shelter warm through the coming winter, basic furniture that made their temporary home feel less like a construction site and more like a place where humans might actually live. Each purchase felt weighted with significance. She was spending money that existed only because someone believed her tea collection was valuable, an assessment that would not be confirmed for months. If the authentication came back negative, if the experts decided the tea was not what they thought, she would owe that $50,000 with no means to repay it. But the alternative had been continuing to sleep in the car as temperatures dropped, continuing to ration bottled water and canned food, continuing to watch her daughter's face close off a little more each day as childhood compressed into survival mode. She chose to spend the money, chose to believe the experts knew what they were looking at, chose to act as though the future they were describing might actually arrive instead of dissolving like every other promise that had been made to her. It felt reckless and necessary in equal measure, the kind of decision that would define what came next regardless of whether the tea proved valuable or worthless. Word of the discovery began to spread despite the security measures and confidentiality agreements. It happened slowly at first, rumors in collector communities, speculation on forums where aged tea enthusiasts traded information. Someone had found a forgotten cache. Details were unclear, but the quantity and quality were supposed to be exceptional. Dr. Chun assured Elena this was inevitable, that secrets of this magnitude could not be kept once authentication began. The key was controlling the narrative, releasing information strategically rather than letting speculation grow unchecked. But the spreading awareness brought consequences Elena had not anticipated. The first journalist who contacted her was respectful, professional, asking if she would be willing to discuss her discovery for a feature article. Elena declined, following Dr. Chin's advice to maintain silence until authentication was complete. The second journalist was more aggressive, calling repeatedly, sending emails that bordered on demanding, threatening to publish speculation if Elena did not provide comment. Dr. Chin's firm handled that one with legal letters that made the harassment stop. Then came the collectors. Phone calls and emails offering to buy portions of the collection before it went to auction. The offers started low, insultingly so, clearly designed to prey on desperation or ignorance. But they climbed quickly as word spread that Elena was not responding. $10 million for the entire collection, sight unseen. $20 million, $30 million, but only if she agreed within 48 hours. Dr. Chin advised against all of them, explaining that premature sales would undervalue the collection by orders of magnitude. Elena listened to the offers with disbelief that gradually transformed into something harder. Each proposal reminded her that there were people who had heard about her discovery and immediately begun calculating how to exploit it. People who assumed a single mother living in a shelter at a ruined plantation would be easy to manipulate, too desperate to recognize the difference between genuine value and a fraction of it. The assumption made her angry in ways she had not allowed herself to feel during the divorce, when anger had seemed too expensive to indulge. She declined every offer with responses drafted by Dr. Chin's legal team, professional statements that revealed nothing about the collection's actual value or her intentions. The refusals generated their own speculation. Forum discussions analyzed her silence as evidence of either exceptional value or complete fraud. Some collectors began claiming she was running a scam, that the tea was worthless and the entire story manufactured for attention. Others insisted she was holding out for prices that suggested the collection was even more valuable than rumors indicated. The attention escalated until Elena could no longer ignore it. Security cameras caught vehicles driving slowly past the plantation's gate, stopping to photograph the access road, the visible structures, anything that might provide information. The security team intercepted 2 separate attempts by people claiming to be tourists who had gotten lost, though their equipment and preparation suggested otherwise. Dr. Chun brought in additional security, 24-hour monitoring, protocols that felt excessive until Elena realized how much money was allegedly sitting beneath that stone floor. Through all of this, Olivia watched with the careful attention of someone learning adult lessons ahead of schedule. Elena tried to shield her daughter from the stress, but the shelter was too small for secrets, and Olivia was too perceptive to miss what was happening. Instead of hiding it, Elena began explaining, teaching her daughter about authentication processes, about why they had to wait, about how value worked when objects were rare and knowledge was limited. Olivia absorbed it all with questions that were sometimes more insightful than Elena found comfortable. She asked why the collectors thought her mother would sell too cheap. Elena explained about desperation, about how people in difficult circumstances were often pressured to make decisions that benefited others more than themselves. Olivia asked why the tea had been hidden if it was valuable. Elena said she did not know, that the plantation's history was still unclear, that maybe whoever had stored it had died before they could retrieve it or tell anyone where it was. Her daughter was quiet for a long time after that conversation, then said something that made Elena stop what she was doing and pay full attention. Olivia said that hiding valuable things only worked if someone remembered where they were, that maybe the person who stored the tea had meant to come back, but never did, and now it was theirs because no one else had cared enough to look. She said it was kind of fair that way, that people who gave away things without checking what they were worth deserved to be surprised when someone else figured it out. Elena heard the edge of vindictiveness in her daughter's voice, the reflection of her own complicated feelings about the family that had rejected them both. She wanted to soften it, to discourage resentment even when it felt justified. But she could not quite bring herself to do it. Because Olivia was right. The family that had dismissed them so completely did deserve to be surprised. And Elena was going to ensure that when they found out what she had discovered, the surprise was as complete and devastating as their cruelty had been. The authentication results began arriving in stages. First came preliminary reports confirming that the tea was legitimate aged pure from recognized producers, stored under conditions that had preserved it exceptionally well. Then came more detailed analyses, laboratory testing that verified production dates and regional characteristics. The experts began providing ranges for valuation, conservative estimates that started at $100 million and climbed rapidly as they examined more of the collection. Dr. Chun called Elena personally to deliver the most significant finding. Among the boxes they had examined was a set of tea cakes from a producer that had won imperial recognition in the early 20th century. Only a few hundred cakes from that particular production were known to exist, and most had been consumed or destroyed during subsequent political upheaval. The 10 cakes Elena's collection contained were museum-quality specimens, individually worth between $5 and $8 million. That single discovery added $80 million to the collection's estimated value. Elena listened to the information with a calm that surprised her. The numbers had grown so large they no longer felt connected to reality. $80 million for 10 cakes of tea. Hundreds of millions for the complete collection. It was monopoly money, figures that existed on spreadsheets, but had no weight, no tangibility. She could not make herself believe it would translate into actual resources she could access. But Dr. Chun continued, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone sharing genuinely exciting news. The authentication had exceeded his initial expectations. The collection was not only valuable, it was historically significant. Museums would compete for portions of it. Private collectors would bid aggressively. Auction houses were already contacting his firm, requesting the opportunity to handle the sale. He recommended they proceed carefully, probably splitting the collection into multiple sales to maximize value rather than flooding the market all at once. He estimated, and he emphasized this was conservative pending complete authentication, that the full collection would likely sell for between $400 and $600 million over a period of 18 to 24 months. After his firm's 20% and various other costs, Elena would net somewhere between $300 and $450 million. A fortune large enough to change not just her life, but the lives of everyone she chose to include in its benefits. $300 million. The number echoed in Elena's mind long after the call ended, refusing to attach itself to anything she could actually conceptualize. She had spent the last month rationing food, calculating whether she could afford bottled water, stretching $50,000 as though it were her last resource on Earth. The gap between that reality and $300 million was so vast she could not build a bridge across it, could not imagine herself on both sides of that divide. That night, she told Olivia what the experts had found. Her daughter listened with the seriousness she had been demonstrating more and more frequently, then asked the question Elena had been avoiding. She asked what they would do with that much money, where they would live, whether Elena would tell her father and his family what they had discovered. Elena answered the first two questions easily. They would buy a house, a real one with solid walls and heat that did not require rationing propane. They would enroll Olivia in a good school where advanced placement programs were standard rather than opportunities that required begging. They would have choices about where to live and what to do, choices not constrained by desperation or limited resources. The third question was harder. Elena had been thinking about it constantly since the authentication results began arriving. Whether to tell her ex-husband's family, whether to let them know that the property they had given her as a joke contained a fortune that eclipsed their own wealth. Whether vindication required witnesses or could be private, known only to herself and her daughter. She told Olivia she had not decided yet. That part of her wanted them to know, wanted to see their faces when they realized what their dismissiveness had cost them. But another part wanted to simply disappear, to build a new life where they were irrelevant, where their opinions and judgments carried no weight. Both choices had merit. Both would feel like victory in different ways. Olivia thought about this, then offered her own opinion with the directness of someone young enough to believe honesty should be simple. She said that Elena should tell them, should make sure they knew exactly what they had given away. Not because it would change anything, her daughter said, but because people who hurt others on purpose should have to face what they did. That knowing they were wrong should not be a private pleasure. It should be something they carried with them, a reminder that cruelty had consequences even when those consequences were not immediately visible. Elena pulled her daughter close, holding her in the small shelter while wind rattled the temporary walls and darkness pressed against the windows. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what Olivia had just offered. Permission for vindication. Validation that anger at injustice was not petty or small, but appropriate and necessary. The decision crystallized in that moment. When the time came, when the authentication was complete and the collection's value confirmed beyond doubt, she would tell them. Not with cruelty, not with the satisfaction of watching them suffer, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had been dismissed and had proven every judgment wrong. She would let them know what they had given away, and then she would walk away from them completely, carrying her daughter into a future they would never be part of again. The authentication process reached completion on a cold December morning, nearly 4 months after Elena had first descended into the chamber beneath the processing building. Dr. Chun called with the final report, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose initial assessment had been vindicated beyond even his own expectations. The complete collection contained 8,214 individual tea cakes, spanning 6 decades of production. After comprehensive laboratory analysis and historical verification, the conservative auction estimate had been set at $540 million. $540 million. Elena wrote the number down in the notebook where she had been tracking developments since the beginning, her handwriting steady despite the tremor in her hands. Dr. Chun continued explaining the sale strategy his firm had developed, the timeline for multiple auctions, the international collectors who had already expressed interest. She listened with part of her attention, while the rest remained fixed on those 9 digits that represented a transformation so complete she still could not fully grasp it. After accounting for Dr. Chen's firm's 20%, various legal and authentication costs, taxes that would consume roughly 40% of the net proceeds, Elena would receive approximately $230 million distributed over 18 months as the sales were completed. $230 million. Enough to ensure Olivia's future through graduation, graduate school, and beyond. Enough to erase debt, purchase security, and build a life unconstrained by financial anxiety. Enough to make every person who had dismissed her irrelevance confront the magnitude of their mistake. The first auction was scheduled for February, 4 months away. It would feature a carefully curated selection of premium pieces designed to establish market interest and set price benchmarks for subsequent sales. Dr. Chun explained that the initial offering would likely gross between $80 and $100 million, providing Elena with her first substantial distribution. Until then, his firm would continue advancing funds for living expenses, though the amounts now felt almost comically unnecessary given what was coming. Elena had already begun preparing for this moment. She had spent weeks researching how to deliver the news she had been holding close since the authentication began. The impulse to simply disappear, to build her new life without confrontation, remained strong. But Olivia's words about consequences had taken root. The family that had engineered her humiliation deserved to understand what their cruelty had cost them. Not because it would repair the damage they had done, but because some wounds required acknowledgement before healing could begin. She drafted the letter over multiple days, refining language that needed to be precise without being vindictive, clear without being cruel. The final version was brief, almost understated in tone. It informed her ex-mother-in-law that the T. Frost estate, transferred to Elena for $1 as part of the divorce settlement, had been discovered to contain a historically significant collection of aged tea. Professional authentication had valued the collection at over $500 million. Following auction sales currently in development, Elena would retain net proceeds exceeding $200 million. The letter thanked the family for their generosity in transferring the property, noting that without their dismissive certainty regarding its worthlessness, she would never have received the inheritance that had transformed her circumstances. She hoped they would take satisfaction in knowing their gift had provided security for their granddaughter's future. The letter was signed simply with her name, no sentimentality, no invitation for further contact. She included with the letter a single photograph, not of the tea, not of the chamber, but of the property deed they had signed transferring ownership for $1. The document they had handled so casually, laughing about appropriate compensation for someone of her background. That image, she thought, would communicate more than any words could. The proof of what they had given away, marked with their own signatures. Elena mailed the letter from the town post office on a Monday morning, using certified delivery that would require a signature confirming receipt. She felt none of the satisfaction she had anticipated. Instead, there was only a quiet sense of completion, of a chapter closing that could not be closed any other way. Whatever their response, it would not reach her. She had included no return address, no contact information beyond the law firm managing the collections trust. They would know what they had done, and that knowledge would have to be consequence enough. The reaction, when it came, arrived not as direct communication, but as ripples Elena observed from a careful distance. Dr. Chin's firm began receiving calls from attorneys representing her ex-husband's family, inquiries about the collection's provenance, whether the property transfer had been legally sound, if there were any grounds to contest Elena's ownership. Each inquiry was met with documentation so comprehensive that no challenge materialized. The divorce settlement had been final, the property transfer absolute. The tea collection had been unknown at the time, making it part of the asset distribution they had voluntarily agreed to. Her ex-husband himself attempted direct contact, emails that arrived through forwarding services and were immediately redirected to Elena's attorneys. She never read them. Whatever he wanted to say, whatever justification or explanation or plea he might offer, was irrelevant. He had made his choices during their marriage and during the divorce. The consequences of those choices were not her concern. But word spread in the ways Elena had both anticipated and failed to fully imagine. Her ex-mother-in-law's social circle was small and tightly interconnected, the kind of community where status was currency and public humiliation was discussed in whispers that ensured everyone heard. The story of the tea plantation, of the fortune hidden beneath property dismissed as worthless, of the rejected wife who had inherited what the established family had carelessly discarded, circulated with variations but consistent core details. Elena heard about it through Dr. Chun, whose contacts in collector communities reported the gossip with amusement. The family's reputation, built on generations of careful image management, suffered damage that money could not easily repair. They had portrayed themselves as arbiters of value and taste, people whose judgment in business and social matters was to be trusted. The revelation that they had given away a $500 million collection without investigation destroyed that carefully maintained image. Questions arose about other decisions, other businesses they operated. If they could be so catastrophically wrong about one asset, what else might they have misjudged? Elena felt no joy in their discomfort, but she felt no regret either. They had engineered her humiliation deliberately, had savored her helplessness, had ensured the divorce settlement would mark her as someone who had failed to maintain standards. That cruelty deserved acknowledgement. The fact that acknowledgement came in the form of public embarrassment felt appropriate rather than excessive. But the vindication she had sought came with complications she had not fully anticipated. The attention that had focused on the tea collection now turned toward her personally. Journalists wanted interviews, magazines wanted profiles. People she had never met contacted her with investment opportunities and charitable requests. The boundary between private transformation and public spectacle began to erode in ways that felt invasive rather than celebratory. Dr. Chin's firm helped her establish protocols for managing the attention. A public relations specialist was hired to handle media inquiries with polite deflections. A security team was expanded to protect not just the plantation, but Elena and Olivia themselves, as their location became more widely known. The temporary shelter was replaced with a small but well-built house on the plantation property, designed to provide actual comfort while security measures were fully implemented. The transformation of their daily life happened gradually and then all at once. The first substantial payment from Dr. Chin's firm arrived in January, an advance of $10 million against future auction proceeds. Elena stared at the bank statement showing that balance, unable to make the numbers feel real. $10 million. More money than she had earned in her entire working life, transferred as though it were routine. She paid off every debt she had accumulated, medical bills and credit card balances, and the last month's rent on the apartment she had abandoned. The total was less than $15,000, a rounding error against the balance that remained. The disproportion felt obscene. She had lost sleep over those debts, had made decisions about what to eat and whether to seek medical care based on payment plans she could not afford. Now they were gone, erased with a few electronic transfers that required less effort than the original purchases had demanded. Olivia's school situation was resolved with equal ease. Instead of the local public school where Elena had been preparing to enroll her, she could now afford private schools with resources that matched her daughter's intelligence. Elena researched options carefully, visiting campuses that had once been economically impossible, speaking with administrators who suddenly treated her with respect that correlated suspiciously with her ability to write large checks. She chose a school an hour away that emphasized academics without the social pretension that had characterized her ex-husband's family's world. Olivia would have opportunities, but not the kind that required her to forget where she had come from. The house was finished in February, just as the first auction approached. It was modest by the standards of the wealth Elena now possessed, but it felt palatial compared to the car and temporary shelter they had occupied for months. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with appliances that worked, a living room with windows that showed the plantation stretching away toward the mountains. Olivia chose her own room, her own furniture, her own colors for walls that would actually stay standing. The night they moved in, Elena watched her daughter lie on a bed that was hers, in a room that was hers, in a house that was theirs, and felt something inside her chest finally unclench after months of constant tension. The February auction exceeded projections. $87 million for a carefully selected group of 200 tea cakes, with prices driven up by competitive bidding between collectors in China, Taiwan, and Singapore. The 10 Imperial Recognition Cakes that Dr. Chun had identified sold for $9.2 million each, establishing a record for aged tea at auction. After fees and costs, Elena received a distribution of $48 million into the trust account that would manage her assets going forward. $48 million from the first auction alone, with multiple sales still scheduled through the following year. The number transformed her understanding of what wealth meant. She had always thought of financial security as having enough to avoid crisis, enough to make reasonable choices without panic. This was different. This was enough to make nearly any choice she wanted for the rest of her life. Enough to ensure Olivia, and potentially Olivia's children, would never face the kind of desperation that had defined Elena's recent past. But the money also brought decisions that felt weighted in new ways. Charitable organizations contacted her constantly, having learned that she had resources and might be inclined to share them. Some requests were clearly opportunistic, form letters that could have been sent to any wealthy person. Others were personal and heartbreaking, from single mothers in situations similar to what Elena had faced, from families destroyed by medical debt or legal costs or circumstances that had cascaded beyond their control. She wanted to help everyone and knew she could not. Knew that even $200 million would disappear quickly if she tried to solve every problem that was brought to her attention. She established a foundation with the help of attorneys who specialized in philanthropic structures. The focus was narrow and specific, supporting single mothers who had been economically abandoned by divorced spouses, helping them access legal representation, education, childcare, the resources that created pathways out of crisis rather than temporary relief. Elena remembered too clearly what it felt like to have no options, to be trapped by circumstances that were not entirely her fault, but had become entirely her responsibility. The foundation would not solve systemic problems, but might change individual lives the way the tea collection had changed hers. The second and third auctions continued the pattern the first had established. Collector interest remained strong, prices held or exceeded estimates, and money flowed into Elena's accounts with a steadiness that began to feel almost routine. By summer, she had received over $120 million in distributions. The remaining sales were scheduled through the following spring, with projections suggesting her final net proceeds would likely exceed the original conservative estimates. She purchased a home in a city 3 hours away from the plantation, a place where Olivia could attend school without the constant attention that had begun to accumulate around their story. The house was comfortable but not ostentatious, located in a neighborhood where wealth was common enough not to attract particular notice. Elena wanted stability for her daughter, normalcy despite circumstances that were anything but normal. She wanted Olivia to have friends who knew her as a person rather than as the girl whose mother had found a fortune in a frozen tea plantation. The plantation itself became something different than Elena had originally imagined. Instead of selling it or abandoning it once the tea was removed, she invested in restoration. The processing building where the chamber had been discovered was carefully preserved, its historical significance documented. The surrounding structures were rebuilt where possible, stabilized where rebuilding was impractical. The fields were cleared and planted not with tea, which would have been symbolically appropriate but agriculturally impractical, but with native species that would restore the land while preventing erosion. The work employed local contractors, brought resources into a region that had few economic opportunities, and transformed ruins into something that honored what the plantation had been while acknowledging what it had become. Elena hired a historian to research the plantation's past, to discover who had built it, who had stored the tea collection, and why it had been abandoned so completely. The story that emerged was complex and tragic. The plantation had been established in the 1930s by a Chinese immigrant family who had brought both tea cultivation knowledge and a collection of premium aged tea from their homeland. The collection had been stored in the underground chamber as insurance, a portable fortune that could be liquidated if circumstances required. But circumstances had intervened in ways the family could not have anticipated. Anti-Chinese sentiment during and after World War II had made their position increasingly precarious. The family had been forced to relocate, and in the chaos of that displacement, the knowledge of the tea collection's location had been lost. The patriarch who had built the chamber had died without telling his children exactly where it was, and by the time those children might have searched for it, the plantation had changed hands multiple times. The tea had remained hidden, protected by engineering designed to last centuries, waiting for someone to need it badly enough to look carefully at property everyone else had dismissed. Learning this history changed how Elena understood her discovery. It was not simply luck or vindication. It was inheritance in a broader sense, a fortune meant to provide security that had waited through generations to fulfill its purpose. The family who had hidden it never benefited. But Elena, another person abandoned by circumstances beyond her control, had. There was symmetry in that, a sense of purpose that transcended simple financial transformation. She tried to locate descendants of the original family, to offer them acknowledgement, if not restitution. But the trail was cold, records incomplete, the diaspora that had scattered them too wide to follow with certainty. The best she could do was ensure their story was documented, that the tea collection's provenance honored their labor and loss, that the fortune they had created was used in ways that reflected values they might have recognized. By the time the final auction concluded in the spring following Elena's discovery, the total proceeds exceeded even the most optimistic projections. $593 million in gross sales, translating to $247 million in net proceeds to Elena after all fees, costs, and taxes. $247 million from property she had been given for $1 as an insult. The bank statements showing that balance felt surreal every time Elena reviewed them. She had grown up in a working-class family where financial security meant having enough in savings to cover 3 months of expenses. She had spent her adult life in jobs where salary increases were celebrated in thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. The gap between that lived experience and her current resources was so vast, it felt like a different reality rather than a progression within the same life. She worried about how the money would change her, whether wealth would erode the empathy that came from having struggled. She worried about Olivia, whether growing up with resources would make her unable to understand people who lack them. These concerns felt privileged in ways that made Elena uncomfortable. But they were real concerns nonetheless, rooted in the understanding that money changed people in ways both obvious and subtle. What she discovered gradually was that the money changed less than she had feared and more than she had hoped. It changed her capacity to help without changing her impulse to do so. It changed her ability to make choices without changing her understanding of what mattered. She was still the person who had fled a destructive marriage with her daughter and whatever they could carry. She was still the person who had slept in a car rather than surrender to helplessness. But now she was also the person who never had to make choices based on desperation, who could afford to be generous because generosity no longer came at the cost of her own security. Olivia adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience of someone young enough to accept transformation without questioning whether it was deserved. She excelled in her new school, made friends whose families had various levels of wealth, and seemed to understand intuitively that having resources was a responsibility rather than simply an advantage. She asked her mother careful questions about the foundation, about how they decided who to help, about whether having money meant they had to share it or simply could choose to. Elena answered honestly, explaining that wealth created obligations not because of rules, but because of recognition. Having been desperate herself made it impossible to ignore desperation in others. The relationship between Elena and Olivia deepened in unexpected ways. The months of struggle they had shared before the discovery had created a bond that wealth strengthened rather than weakened. They had survived together when survival was uncertain. Now they were building together with resources that felt both earned and unearned, deserved and excessive. The tension between those feelings became something they discussed openly, working through the complexity of their transformation instead of pretending it was simple. 2 years after Elena had first arrived at the Tea Frost estate, she received a letter that had been forwarded through multiple addresses before reaching her. The envelope was expensive, the handwriting careful, the return address associated with a law firm she recognized as representing her ex-husband's family. Elena opened it with caution, expecting legal challenges or final attempts at manipulation. What she found instead was something she had not anticipated. The letter was from her ex-mother-in-law, written in the woman's own hand rather than through an attorney. It was brief and formal, its tone carefully controlled. The woman acknowledged the tea collection, acknowledged that she had underestimated the property's value, and acknowledged that her treatment of Elena during the divorce had been intended to humiliate. She offered no apology, which Elena found oddly refreshing in its honesty. But she said that watching her granddaughter's future become secure through resources her family had carelessly discarded had forced her to confront certain assumptions about worth and merit that perhaps deserved examination. The letter concluded by asking if Elena would permit her to see Olivia occasionally, not as a grandmother with rights, but as someone requesting a privilege she understood she had not earned. She said she would respect whatever Elena decided, that this was not an attempt to manipulate or to rebuild a relationship that had been destroyed by her own actions. It was simply a request from someone who was learning too late that cruelty had cost beyond what she had imagined when she chose to indulge it. Elena read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden manipulation or strategic positioning. She found none, only the careful language of someone trying to acknowledge fault without dissolving completely into regret. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she showed the letter to Olivia and asked her daughter what she thought, whether she wanted contact with her father's family, whether she was curious about them, or preferred the clean break they had maintained since the divorce. Olivia thought about it for several days before answering. She said she did not miss her grandmother, did not feel a pull toward reconnection, but she thought it might be interesting to see her grandmother's face when she realized how wrong she had been, not just about the property, but about Elena herself. Her daughter said this with a small smile that reminded Elena painfully of her own complicated feelings about vindication. The apple, she thought, did not fall far from the tree. They arranged a single meeting, carefully structured and limited in duration. It took place at a restaurant Elena chose, neutral territory where no one had history or advantage. Her ex-mother-in-law arrived precisely on time, dressed with the same careful attention to appearance that Elena remembered, but carrying herself with less certainty. The confidence that had once felt like armor now looked fragile, as though it might crack under too much scrutiny. The conversation was awkward and stilted, filled with careful words and topics that avoided the central issues everyone was thinking about. Her ex-mother-in-law asked Olivia about school and received polite answers that revealed nothing personal. She commented on how much Olivia had grown, as though 2 years were an unprecedented amount of time rather than exactly what would be expected. She did not ask about Elena's circumstances directly, but her eyes moved constantly, assessing Elena's clothes, her watch, her bearing, calculating wealth with the same reflexive habit that had defined their previous interactions. Near the end of the meeting, Olivia excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Elena alone with the woman who had engineered so much of her humiliation. The silence stretched between them, heavy with words that remained unspoken. Finally, her ex-mother-in-law broke it, her voice quieter than Elena had ever heard it. She said that she had been certain Elena would fail, that the property had been chosen specifically because it would demonstrate how unable Elena was to maintain standards her marriage had elevated her toward. She had wanted Elena to surrender it quickly, to sign it back to the county in defeat, providing proof that she had never belonged in their world. Elena listened without expression, letting the confession settle between them. When her former mother-in-law finished, Elena spoke with a calm that felt earned rather than performed. She said she understood that the cruelty had been intentional, that understanding did not create forgiveness, but it did create clarity. She said that the tea collection had changed her circumstances, but not her understanding of herself. She had never failed to belong in their world. She had simply discovered that their world was not where she wanted to belong. Her ex-mother-in-law absorbed this with a slight nod, as though confirming something she had already suspected. She asked if Elena had felt satisfaction when the family learned about the tea collection's value, if vindication had provided the pleasure it was supposed to. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. She said satisfaction was too simple a word for what she had felt. Relief, yes. Validation, certainly. But also a kind of grief for the years she had spent believing that their judgment of her worth mattered. The tea collection had not proven them wrong about her. It had proven that their metrics for measuring worth were fundamentally flawed. Olivia returned before the conversation could continue, and the meeting ended with polite words that committed to nothing. Elena did not expect further contact, and none came. But something had shifted in that brief exchange. The anger Elena had carried since the divorce had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more sustainable. Not forgiveness, which would have been premature and possibly dishonest, but release. An acknowledgement that carrying the weight of their judgment served no purpose now that she had proven capable of building a life entirely separate from their influence. In the months that followed, Elena settled into patterns that began to feel like a new normal. The foundation she had established grew under professional management, helping dozens of women in circumstances similar to what she had faced. She received letters from some of them, stories of escapes made possible by resources that gave them options beyond surrender. Each letter reminded her of how narrow her own margin had been, how easily desperation could have won if she had not stumbled upon the one thing no one had expected the plantation to contain. The plantation itself became a retreat where Elena and Olivia spent weekends and school breaks, a place that held the memory of struggle without requiring them to remain in it. The restored buildings housed a small museum documenting the property's history, open to visitors by appointment, but primarily serving as a record of what had been built and lost and found again. The chamber where the tea had been stored remained preserved, empty now, but maintained as evidence of the engineering that had protected a fortune through generations of neglect. Elena hired staff to manage the property, local people who appreciated the employment and took pride in maintaining something that had become part of regional history. She heard from them occasionally about visitors who came to see where the famous tea collection had been discovered, tourists drawn by stories that had grown in the telling. She did not visit during those times, preferring to let the plantation exist independently of her presence. It was important to her that the place be understood as more than just the site of her transformation. It was a piece of history that deserved recognition for what it had been before she arrived, and what it might become after she was gone. Olivia graduated from her private school with honors and multiple college acceptances to institutions that would have been impossible when they were sleeping in the car at the plantation's edge. She chose a university known for its engineering program, saying that she wanted to understand how things were built to last, how structures endured beyond their creators' intentions. Elena heard in this choice an echo of the chamber that had held their fortune, the precision of its engineering, the care that had gone into creating something meant to survive centuries. On the day they moved Olivia into her dormitory, Elena stood in the parking lot watching students and parents flow past with the same mixture of anxiety and hope that seemed universal to such moments. She thought about the lawyer's office where she had signed papers accepting the tea plantation, about the ruins that had greeted them that first day, about the moment when she had pressed down on hidden stone and revealed what everyone else had missed. The path from that moment to this one felt both impossibly long and surprisingly short, marked by decisions that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had accumulated into transformation. Olivia appeared beside her, breaking through the memory. Her daughter had finished organizing her room with the efficiency she had learned during their months of transient living, when every possession needed a purpose and a place. They stood together watching the campus activity, neither speaking until Olivia broke the silence with a question Elena had been half expecting. Her daughter asked if she ever wished things had been different, if she wished she had never married into the family that had treated her so badly, if she regretted the path that had led them to sleeping in a car in an abandoned plantation. Elena thought about the question seriously before answering. She said that she wished certain parts had been different, that Olivia had never had to watch her mother struggle in ways that children should not have to witness. But she did not wish away the experience entirely, because struggle had taught them both things that comfort never could. They had learned that survival was not just endurance, but also the capacity to recognize opportunity when it came disguised as disaster. They had learned that value existed in places everyone else overlooked, that fortune sometimes rewarded not effort alone, but the willingness to look carefully at what others had dismissed. Olivia nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, then said something that made Elena's eyes sting with sudden tears. Her daughter said that the tea collection had given them money, but the months before they found it had given them each other in ways that wealth could not have bought. That she would not trade the memory of sitting by that fire eating canned soup, of working together in the chamber documenting boxes, of building a life from nothing with just the two of them. The money was wonderful, Olivia said, but the survival had been important. Elena pulled her daughter close, holding her in the parking lot, while students flowed past them carrying boxes and bags into buildings that would house new chapters of hundreds of lives. She said nothing because there was nothing to add to what Olivia had just offered, the gift of perspective that transformed the hardest months of their lives into something precious despite the pain they had contained. That night, alone in the hotel room where she would stay before driving back to the city the next morning, Elena opened her laptop and drafted an email to the foundation staff. She wanted to expand the criteria for assistance, to include not just legal and financial support for single mothers, but also mentorship programs. Support from other women who had survived similar circumstances and built stable lives afterward. She wanted recipients to know not just that they could survive, but that survival could lead to transformation that made the struggle meaningful even when it remained painful in memory. The email grew longer as she wrote, ideas accumulating faster than she could organize them. Eventually, she stopped, recognizing that what she was really trying to express was too complex for a single message. The foundation would evolve over time. She understood, shaped by the needs it encountered and the resources it could deploy. Her job was not to control that evolution, but to ensure it remained rooted in the understanding that came from having lived the crisis it addressed. She closed the laptop and stood at the window, looking out at the campus where her daughter slept in a dormitory room paid for by tea leaves hidden for generations beneath forgotten stone. The distance from that conference room, where she had signed divorce papers, to this moment felt impossible to calculate. Not in time, which had been less than 3 years, but in transformation. She was not the same person who had accepted a worthless plantation as final compensation for a failed marriage. She was not even the same person who had discovered the tea collection and imagined it would solve all her problems. She was someone who had learned that wealth and security were not the same thing, that vindication required witnesses, but satisfaction could be private, that the greatest gifts sometimes came wrapped in circumstances that looked like punishment. The tea had given her resources beyond anything she had imagined possible. But the struggle before the discovery had given her something more important. The knowledge that she could survive when survival seemed impossible, that her worth was not determined by others' judgment, and that the most valuable inheritances were sometimes the ones no one had intended to leave behind. 3 years after Elena had first opened the hidden chamber beneath the tea frost estate, she received an unexpected visitor at the foundation's office. A young woman, perhaps 25, arrived without appointment and asked to speak with Elena personally. The staff tried to redirect her through normal channels, but she insisted with a quiet intensity that Elena recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone who had traveled a long distance to deliver information that could not be entrusted to email or intermediaries. Elena agreed to see her, and the young woman entered her office with nervous formality. She introduced herself as Sarah Lynn, explaining that her grandmother had recently passed away and that among her grandmother's papers had been documents relating to the tea frost estate. The old woman had been the daughter of the family that built the plantation, Sarah said. She had been a child when they were forced to leave, had spent her entire life carrying the knowledge that her father had hidden something valuable on that property, but had never been able to remember exactly where. Sarah handed Elena a leather folder, its contents protected by plastic sleeves. Inside were photographs from the 1930s and 1940s showing the plantation in its prime. Tea plants arranged in careful rows, the processing building intact and bustling with workers, and a family portrait that showed people whose engineering and care had created the collection Elena had discovered. There were also documents, letters written in Chinese that Sarah offered to translate, describing the tea collection and the chamber where it had been stored. Elena listened as Sarah explained that her grandmother had tried multiple times over the decades to locate the plantation, but property records were incomplete and the family name had been changed multiple times during their relocations. By the time Sarah's grandmother had accumulated enough resources to hire professional researchers, the plantation had changed hands so many times that tracing its history had become impossibly complex. The old woman had died, believing the tea collection was lost forever, destroyed by time, or discovered and sold by someone who had no idea of its significance. Sarah said she had learned about Elena's discovery through news articles covering the auction sales. She had contacted Dr. Chen's firm to verify the provenance, confirming that the tea Elena had found was the same collection her great-grandfather had stored. She was not requesting compensation, Sarah emphasized. The legal transfer was absolute, and her family had no claim to proceeds from sales already completed. But she had wanted to meet Elena personally, to ensure that the collection story was preserved accurately, and to thank her for protecting something that her family had built but could not maintain. Elena felt the weight of inheritance settling over her in new ways. The tea had not been abandoned carelessly. It had been hidden by people desperate to protect it, and then lost through circumstances beyond their control. She had benefited from their tragedy, had built security on the foundation of their displacement. The moral complexity of that felt suddenly overwhelming. She told Sarah about the museum at the plantation, about the historian she had hired to document its past, about her attempts to find the original family's descendants. She said she had established a scholarship fund in the name of the family who built the plantation, using proceeds from the tea sales to support educational opportunities for descendants of Chinese immigrants who had faced discrimination. It was inadequate, Elena knew, but it was the best she had been able to devise. Sarah listened with an expression Elena could not quite read, then said something that shifted the moment's weight. She said that her grandmother would have been glad the tea had helped someone, that protecting it had served a purpose even though her family never benefited. The old woman had believed objects should serve human needs, Sarah explained. That tea stored and never drunk was wasted regardless of its value. The collection had waited almost a century to fulfill the purpose it was meant for, providing security when it was desperately needed. That it had helped Elena instead of Sarah's family did not diminish its purpose. It confirmed it. The grace of this statement, the refusal to claim victimhood or demand restitution, moved Elena more deeply than she could immediately express. She asked Sarah what she could do, how she might honor the family that had made her. Fortune possible. Sarah thought about this, then suggested something Elena had not considered. She asked if the museum at the plantation might include a more comprehensive exhibit about her family, about the Chinese immigrant communities that had built agricultural enterprises throughout the region only to be displaced by policies and prejudice. She said that inheritance was not just about objects or wealth, but about stories that deserved preservation even when the people who lived them were gone. Elena agreed immediately, committing foundation resources to expand the museum and hire curators who could document the history with appropriate depth and respect. She asked Sarah if she would serve as a consultant on the project, ensuring that her family's story was told accurately and completely. Sarah agreed, and they began a collaboration that continued over the following years, transforming the plantation from a site of personal transformation into something larger. A place that acknowledged how wealth moved through communities, how loss in one generation could become discovery in another, and how the past never truly disappeared but waited to be understood by people willing to look carefully at what others had dismissed. The final auction of tea from the collection was held on a spring morning 5 years after Elena's initial discovery. It was a small sale, just 50 pieces that had been held back to assess long-term market appreciation. The prices achieved set new records, confirming that the collection's value had grown even after most of it had been sold. Elena attended this auction personally, something she had avoided during the previous sales. She sat in the back of the auction house, watching collectors compete for the final pieces with the same intensity they had shown at the beginning. When the last piece sold, the auctioneer thanked attendees and acknowledged that the T. Frost Estate collection had been not just commercially significant, but historically important. A testament to the preservation capabilities of traditional storage methods and the enduring value of authentic craftsmanship. The room erupted in polite applause, and Elena slipped out before anyone could recognize her or request comment. She drove back to the plantation alone, needing the time and solitude to process the closure. The collection was gone now, dispersed to collectors and museums around the world. The chamber beneath the processing building was empty, its purpose fulfilled. The plantation would continue operating as a museum and retreat, but its identity would no longer be tied to the fortune it had contained. It would become whatever the next chapter required it to be. Elena stood at the edge of the processing building as evening settled over the mountains, looking out at land that had given her everything when she had nothing left. The tea had transformed her circumstances, but the plantation itself had transformed her understanding of what mattered. Struggle and discovery, loss and inheritance, vindication and grace. All of it layered together into a story that was hers, but also larger than her, connecting her to people she had never met across decades of hiding and hoping. She thought about the lawyer's office where this had begun, about the contempt that had been designed to ensure she knew her place, about the $1 they had charged for property they believed was worthless, about the satisfaction they had expected to feel watching her accept humiliation as though it were generosity. They had been wrong about everything. Wrong about the property, wrong about her, wrong about how cruelty would echo forward through time. But she had been wrong too, Elena realized. Wrong to believe that vindication required their acknowledgement. Wrong to think that proving them mistaken would erase the damage their judgment had done. The tea collection had given her wealth and security, had proven that value existed where they saw only worthlessness. But healing had come not from their forced recognition of error, but from building a life that made their opinions irrelevant. As darkness gathered and lights came on in the small house where she and Olivia stayed during plantation visits, Elena allowed herself a moment of quiet gratitude. Not for the tea, though its discovery had been life-changing. Not even for the wealth, though its impact could not be dismissed. But for the months of struggle that had taught her to look carefully at what others overlooked, to persevere when perseverance seemed pointless, and to recognize that inheritance took many forms. Some measured in dollars, others in strength. The tea had been valuable, but the survival that preceded its discovery had been invaluable. She walked back to the house where her daughter waited, carrying with her the knowledge that their story would be told and retold, probably growing in embellishment with each iteration. A betrayed, single mother inheriting a frozen tea plantation as a joke, discovering a fortune that vindicated her when everyone else had written her off. The facts would be mostly correct, the emotional arc satisfying, the message about overlooked value clear. But the real story, Elena thought, was quieter and more complex. It was about refusing to accept others' assessment of your worth, about making impossible decisions with insufficient information and somehow surviving them, about the inheritance that came not from what people meant to give you, but from what they carelessly discarded without understanding its significance. The tea had been extraordinary, but the true miracle had been simpler. A woman and her daughter, surviving together through circumstances designed to break them, finding in that survival the strength to recognize opportunity when it finally appeared. The lights of the house were warm against the darkness, and Olivia's silhouette moved past the window. Elena climbed the steps to the porch, leaving behind the empty chamber and the completed story, walking toward the next chapter that would be written not by fortune hidden in stone, but by choices made with clear eyes and hard-won wisdom. The plantation had given her tea worth hundreds of millions. But she had given herself something worth infinitely more. The certainty that she could survive anything, build from nothing, and transform wounds into wisdom that no one could take away. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.